Alright, friends, we are going to talk about what I would imagine most people consider the biggest breakthrough invention in the history of Adobe Photoshop. That is editing with layers. I think layers came out, it's a function, right? It's an editing function. I think it was introduced in 1995. Some of us were sophomores in high school. I wasn't a photographer back then, so I didn't really care about layers, but I do now. Um, they have completely changed how Photoshop operates, and they are so extremely useful. I'm going to explain to you in this short video, before we dive into the heavy lifting of editing, why we're using layers, and why you wouldn't just edit on the photograph. So, when we make layers, we are doing just that. We are adding adjustments, changes, edits on top of our background of our photograph. So if we go over here to the bottom right, this is our layers panel. We always start out with a background layer. Okay, our background layer is our photograph. I don't think we can turn that off right now. It's just the photograph, right? And every layer that we put on top of it is acting as kind of like a filter, right? So we think of it as like we're making these adjustments. So you have on your table you have your photograph, and then you have these semi-transparent filters that you put over the top to make adjustments, whether it's changing the contrast, the color, the tonality, the saturation, any of that stuff, right? Those are all done with layers. And then once we get our image exactly where we want it, we can flatten those layers all into an image. So it is kind of like a predecessor of the Lightroom model of editing. So Lightroom is really what's called non-destructive editing. You're always working on a preview of a photograph, and those changes aren't applied to the actual photograph until you export it out of Lightroom. Some of you guys might remember that from 142. And that's a little bit how layers work. Now, layers are still destructive. It's still actually changing the pixels of your image, but it's not as destructive as actually editing the background, okay? So I'm just going to kind of show you what that looks like, editing just the background. So, right, we go up to the menu here, and we could go Image, Adjustments, and you could adjust anything, right? We could adjust the exposure. Just say Exposure. Remember, this isn't doing the raw edits, right? The raw edits is changing the actual data of the photograph, just like if it was in camera, okay? This is adding a filter over the top, okay? So this is destructive. So I'm just going to say, oh, okay, that looks great, okay. Okay, well, that's what my photo looks like, right? There's the background, and it's been changed. The pixels have been changed. It's currently being destroyed, right? I can always go to history and click back, but that's kind of a pain to always have to do that. And remember, or I actually don't think I might have told you this yet, history only records 35 steps, I believe, by default. And so if you do a bunch of those edits, image, adjustment, whatever, you could fill that up and not be able to get back to the original image. So that is how editing was done in Photoshop before 1995. So, right, let me just do some more adjustments here to show you like how bad you could screw things up. We're changing the background. We're just changing the photograph. That is crazy, and there's not really any control in it. So let's skip back to the beginning. You can always jump back in history, 35 steps to when you opened it or before you messed up your image. So that was how things were done in Photoshop before 1995. Now we have layers. Layers are, they're not changing the actual photograph quite yet. So let me show you how to make a layer. So if we go up to layer, you got new adjustment layer, new fill layer. Those are both useful, but adjustment layer is what we're mainly going to focus on in this class. We will talk a little bit about fill layers. Actually, I think we might have already done that in the intro assignment. And if not, we'll get to it. So the new adjustment layer, right? And you could go, let's go exposure, just like we did with the image adjustment. So now when I do that and hit OK, now we see that on top of the background, here is this layer of exposure. And I can change the slider just like I did when I edited the image. So let's make it kind of crazy. I would never, ever use the exposure layer, just to let you know. So let's say that this is my image, right? I can turn this layer off by hitting this little preview icon, which is this little eyeball icon, and my image is back to normal. I could also just drag it down to this garbage and throw it away. So that's a benefit of not editing on the actual photograph, is we're going to be building our photographs from a foundation, right? The very base of the foundation is the background. Then we're going to do these foundational edits on top of that, and then we're going to start getting into the more localized edits. You want to be able to know what each adjustment is doing to your photograph in case you have to backtrack. If you get to step 10 and realize that step 2 is off, if you did that in image adjustment, you're stuck with it. If you do it in layers, you can click back through your layers. So let me just throw a couple layers on here. Let's go curves. Okay. Layer. Adjustment layer. Now this is not how I'd ever edit a photo, but I'm just showing you this just for a demo. Okay. Right, so now we're building these layers on. Once we get to the end of this class, you're probably going to have images with like, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 different layers. So you're going to want to know what they did, right? Because I could take this brightness contrast layer, and I actually see students do this all the time where they try to solve a bunch of problems with the same or with different tools. So let's say I did that with a brightness contrast. We're down to this curves layer. We'll dive more into this stuff later so you know how to use this stuff. So let's just say that this is my image, and I'm like, yeah, man, that doesn't look that good, right? And I turn off brightness contrast. Well, that still doesn't look that good. Now imagine if you had like 15 or 20 different layers, and you have to click through it to find out where you made the mistake. So you always, right? You always want to limit the amount of layers that you're making, and you're not going to want to repeat information. So another thing that we're going to cover later in the semester is this idea that Photoshop has been around for a really long time, 35 years, I think. And very few things have left Photoshop, but a lot of stuff has been put into Photoshop. And so there's things like a curves layer and brightness contrast. Those two things actually do the same thing a different way. Curves is like a more subtle and nuanced way of adjusting brightness and contrast. So if a student shows me their image and I see their layers like this, I'd be like, oh, you don't know what you're doing, because if you didn't fix it here, why did you throw this on top? You could fix these two things are doing the same lifting. You don't need both of these things, right? And so, right, I would never use that. So once again, when we go in for the rest of the semester, we're going to always go layer, new adjustment layer. You're going to get sick and tired of me saying that. And you see this whole list. We're not going to use this whole list. Brightness contrast, like I said, does the same thing as levels, which does the same thing as curves. These three things do the same thing. Curves is just the most controlled way of doing it, of controlling the balance of the blacks, whites, and midtones in your photograph. And so we're going to use curves. I'm not showing you brightness and contrast and levels, not because I'm like lazy. It's because, you know, anybody with a level of like desire for control over these adjustments would use curves because it's a more advanced tool than levels or brightness and contrast. That doesn't mean that these are wrong. It's just they're not as refined of a tool as curves. But like I said, things get added into Photoshop. Very few things leave Photoshop. So just keep that in mind. So the other thing that I want to show you, let me just go back to this curve here, is in our curve or in our layer stack, right? We can always throw away layers by just highlighting them and dragging them to the garbage can. Or I think you can go control click, and delete layer. Okay, so you can always do that. You always want to be clicked on the top layer before you add another one, because if we go to this curves layer down here and I go layer, new adjustment layer, no, let me do something other than hue saturation. Layer, new adjustment layer, photo filter, it's going to add it above the filter, or above the layer that I had selected. So it didn't put it on the top of the stack. So we want to kind of build from the background up. We always want the newest layer on top. Okay, we want to just keep this stuff really organized. That's not the biggest deal right now because we're not doing a ton of editing at this stage, but we will be. And if we can get you in the practice of having really clean organization in your layers, you'll be happier down the road. So, other thing I want to show you is in each layer, right, each adjustment layer, there's two parts of it. there is this white rectangle. That's what's called your mask. So when you click on that, we see Properties Masks, okay? We're going to use this later on in the semester. The other is the adjustment. So wherever these little white little brackets are around is what you have selected. And when it's around the adjustment, we see the control, the properties of the actual adjustment. This is how we're going to change our photograph. I could change the saturation in my photograph right here. I could change the hue of my photograph right here. But if I was clicked on this, you see that that's not there anymore. So something that students often kind of get tripped up on is they'll be editing their photo and they'll accidentally click on the mask when they want to be on the adjustment and be like, wait, where is my, how do I adjust this? I can't fix it. And all you have to do is go from the mask to the adjustment, okay? Now notice in your background, you don't have a mask or an adjustment. So that's just in adjustment layers. You have a mask and an adjustment. If you want to change what your photo looks like, you use the adjustment. Layer mask, we're going to talk about later on in the semester. Okay, I hope that was useful for you, and I hope it explains why we're going to be using layers. It is the industry standard of how you would edit with Photoshop, and it is actually something that is more refined, definitely more refined than Lightroom. So I hope that clarifies for you.